think. So I wanted to start with this image of a looming dystopia, which I think has been the inspiration or the catalyst for many of us to think about sustainability. And but what this looming dystopia has been more like is like a boiling frog. It's actually not been a crisis, enough of a crisis. You may all remember back when we had Mr. Rudd talk about the greatest moral challenge of our lifetime, and then the GFC came along and it all got sort of pushed aside. And it's a bit like what's happened here in Australia. And I know you New Zealanders had a whiff of what we had here in Australia with the bushfires. It was all, over the last few months, the beginning of the end of last year and the beginning of this year, it was ever present, this issue with the climate and the way we'd been trashing our land or not caring for our land. But then now the pandemic has come along and it's no longer on the cards anymore. So the catalyst for me historically has been not so much this question of climate change. It's been this question of how we've been unable to there's been this incapacity to, from a collective sense, to address these issues. And I found that government and my role in infrastructure development, I was with a family infrastructure company, an engineering contracting company called Transfield, and we had a lot of interaction with governments, and that interaction gave me the opportunities to meet with the politicians, meet with the public servants. We're involved in quite a few public-private partnerships, and I got quite intimate understanding of how major projects were being developed and how the political class actually went about those projects, and in the process, how we as at the big end of town, if you like, got approached to assist with their various political ambitions on one side of politics or the other. So I'd often be going to these fundraising dinners and lunches, and it sort of raised the question in my mind, well, which party do I support? And I came to the realization that from my perspective, at least, that there wasn't much difference between the warring factions, that they were mostly into salesmanship rather than statesmanship. And so I started to investigate this question of how to do politics better. And I was fortunate enough to enlist the support of a number of high-profile politicians, ex-politicians at the time, Fred Chaney from WA and John Button from Victoria, and they were very, very generous in exploring with us at the time. So I built this organisation called the newDemocracy Foundation, and our interest was trying to explore whether we could do politics better, because the way I saw politics was this way. Basically, the political actors are really not looking at collaboration. They're talking at each other, and they're looking to actually, if you like, manufacture their differences. They want to distinguish themselves one from the other, because that is the nature of the way we affect political representation. And I was really frustrated to understand how, in fact, you could end up with a more collaborative model, and to that extent, we in establishing the foundation, introduced a number of academics, Martin Krieger, Professor Lynn Carson, the late Ian Marsh, and we started looking at what alternatives are there, and we started getting enthusiastic about the alternative, which is the basic umbrella of deliberative democracy. And I'm about to show you a little 2-minute video clip which talks to to this. Actually, you should hear this fairly well. It might be a bit loud. It only goes for a couple of minutes, so please hope you enjoy it.
Most of us believe that if you hold elections, you automatically get democracy. But is this true? History shows that elections do not always create democracies. They can even bring dictators to power. For 3,000 years, humans have been experimenting with democracy. But elections only entered the game some 200 years ago, with the American and French revolutions. So what was there before? The answer is surprising. Lottery, or sortition, to use the technical term. Of the 7,000 public functions in ancient Athens, only 100 were elected. All the rest were assigned by lot. Even if only 3 adult men could be drafted, the range of tasks given to them was impressive. The system was based on 3 principles. If you draft people by lot, you get everyday people in government. If you give them time and information, they find solutions that work. And if you do it often, more and more people get involved. This system worked. It increased public trust, it diminished corruption, and it fostered long-term thinking. Elections were not introduced to make democracy possible, but to stop democracy. Only very few people could vote, even less could run for office. Elections had to create a new elite, a natural aristocracy as Thomas Jefferson called it. Power had to remain in the hands of a minority. In the 19th and 20th century, more and more people obtained the right to vote and run for office. This was a necessary improvement, but in the 21st century, it's no longer sufficient. Today, many people feel that ticking a box every 4 or 5 years is simply not enough. They still don't feel heard. That's why distrust is raising at an alarming rate. What if people were not only given the right to vote, but also a right to speak? Going back to lottery sounds crazy, but we're using it already every day. We call it opinion polls. The only problem is, polls ask us what we think when we don't think. What if we had a chance to think and discuss with others first? And what if politicians listened then? We urgently need to democratize democracy.
So I hope that gives you a taste of the sort of radical position that we're coming from. We think that there is a way to do democracy which is beyond the way we're doing it today. And we are encouraged by this other way. I mentioned that the general umbrella called deliberative democracy. What it essentially amounts to is the way democracy was originally conceived. So the way democracy was originally conceived was as an inclusive, collaborative, deliberative exercise. It wasn't devised as a electioneering tournament, where basically people had to get up and make out as if they are better than the next person, and in that process actually effectively make a divisive society in the process. So we were wanting to show how this process could be really enacted, and we weren't the first to do it either here in Australia. There has been colleagues, now they've become colleagues, that have done it since the 70s. Actually, this question of citizen juries or democratic lotteries have been invented actually in Germany and the US in the early 70s, and slowly they became taken up by various government levels, mostly at the local government level, increasingly at the state and then the federal level. So probably the most highest profile example has been the one in Ireland in 2012. I'm going to show you further on in the presentation that the OECD have now identified close to 300 so-called mini publics. We call these mini publics because what you're getting is a reflection of the broader population at large. And so there's now been close to 300 of these processes done around the world. In Ireland, the one was for the so-called Constitutional Convention, when 99 people came together, 66 of whom were randomly recruited, and the balance were 33 MPs. And they deliberated on their constitution. And you may recall, recently they've had this issue with, recently the issue with the abortion, which was enshrined in their constitution. They could not, Irish could not have an abortion in their country and without turning it over in a referendum. And the Constitutional Convention led to that referendum and the referendum being recommended by government along the lines of what the Citizens' Assembly coming out of the Constitutional Convention put forward. So that was one example. I'm about to show you now the next one, which is the most recent one I mentioned, which is this one here in Sydney. And here is the screen again. Well. So here is the layout of Sydney. We were asked back in last year by the City of Sydney to design and convene a citizens' jury to look at their vision for 2050. Back in 2005, the city had done an exercise for their vision back then, and they called it the Vision 2030. So here they are now in 2020, some 15 years later, wanting to do a vision for the next 30 years, 2050. Is that confusing enough? It's probably confusing enough for me the way I've now described those numbers, but essentially the exercise that they went through before 15 years ago was a fairly standard public consultation exercise where they had town hall meetings, they had focus groups, they had surveys, and that process helped them design their 2030 vision. This time round, they were convinced, and I think we had some role in convincing them, that a better approach to having a public consultation would be to have this citizen jury approach, this mini public approach, where a quintessential representation of the public is actually in the room and are given the opportunity to actually deliberate on the subject matter, which is what, in fact, the question was, the mandate for the participants, the citizen participants, was what concepts should be implemented in Sydney by 2050. So the process starts with the invitation, and here is the invitation here, which was a hard copy with the Lord Mayor's logo, the council logo, and the Lord Mayor's name on it, asking people to, if they were interested, to participate. 15,000 of these invitations went out to the Greater Sydney area, 50% to the LGA, the local government area, which, as you know, in Sydney is quite small, just from the east to the King's Cross, and to the west to the Glebe, and the south to Mascot. So it was felt that because so much of the Sydney workers and visitors come from beyond the Sydney LGA, then 50% of the invitations should go to that broader community. So that's what happened. 15,000 invitations went out, and 600 people responded. That doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not, but in terms of what they were asked to do, the citizens were asked to spend 6 Saturdays from the period of August to November of last year in deliberation with others and studying online between those Saturdays, to dedicate that sort of time for this exercise. So that's kind of the standard response we get. There was clearly no obligation. It's not like a criminal jury. There's no obligation for these participants to come to the party. So from that pool of 600 willing participants, a random draw was done again to select the 50 participants, citizens who would then go forward for those 3 months. And and there was a demographic cross-check to ensure that the age, gender, and general income distribution matched the geography of or the demographic of the region that we're talking about, which is the Greater Sydney region. So, what this process, here is the cover sheet of the report that they produced. But what the process is about is having a series of small groups and plenaries discussing in a continuous fashion over these 6 Saturdays with, this is facilitated by clearly expert facilitators, but also in starting off with the city itself, making presentations on what they understand to be the challenges for Sydney over the next 30 years, and drawing upon not just their own professional expertise, but also the professional expertise of others that they've come in contact with. And then from that start, the citizens themselves are given the opportunity to select and direct in which way they would like to see the discussions going, so that there is it becomes their deliberation. What they are looking to do is to find where they have agreement. And so this is the big challenge with these juries. When I say that there is no collaboration that happens in the political sphere normally because of the systemic, and I noticed Ashley and Janie used the word systemic. Well, there are systemic problems in our governance structure as far as I'm concerned, and many people are reading it that way as well. Here, there's no systemic obstacles for people to collaborate. And this is the great joy of this process. You see people that are genuinely, sincerely looking to find common ground amongst themselves. And it really is an inspirational exercise to see how the diversity of these people can find this common ground with all the different backgrounds they have, the different age groups and genders. And they do it in a way which is not acrimonious, which is so much of what we hear in from our political class, because that is the very nature of the way we are used to hearing politics. It's all about point scoring, trying to get the one up over the other, and we think that is a great way to develop public policy. I think it is totally suboptimal. It is not just frustrating. It is unproductive, in my view. And that's my experience, having seen it from the other side fairly close up with my infrastructure background. So, but what I think is important to understand too about this plenary small group dynamic is that actually a lot of the collaboration, in fact, the real collaboration is actually done in the small group. And these small groups, they actually move between each other, so that the people are encouraged to mix across tables, and so that people get to hear from others. And also there are certain rules that are developed at the very beginning, or at least guidelines, such as in these small groups where we're looking to have no more than 6 or 7, everyone gets an opportunity to speak, to have their voice heard. And what's often the case in these larger public gatherings, whether it's a town hall meeting, it doesn't matter which gathering, even in business meetings or conferences, it's only the confident people that actually get up and speak. So what this small group dynamic provides is that opportunity for the shy and to come forward. And as we all know, it's not just the articulate and the forthright that have good ideas. It's everyone. So what we've done, what these people did, the 50 people did, at the end of the 3 months, they came up with their report. They wrote the report. There was enough people with word processing capacity and presentation capacities, not just presentation capacity to write it, but also to present it. There was an evening that was provided by the council where the 50 jurors came. They determined who was going to present, and they presented. And they presented these 8 concepts. So in the white here, you'll see that there are 8 concepts. Starting off with participatory governance, First Peoples of Australia legislative representation, and then interesting to see here, of course, the circular economy that Janie and Ashley were talking about, regenerative ecosystem, housing for all. I won't read them all. You can see them there yourselves. But what was the pleasant surprise for me, and mind you, we as the New Democracy as a foundation, we have a small team of executives. There's only 3 or 4 of us. We designed the concept, we designed the process, such as the recruitment process. We actually lead the recruitment process to ensure that, you know, we get the 50 people in the room, or however many in this particular case, it was 50, that was the number that we thought to be adequate. And we oversee the actual exercise of the jurors in the actual room. But we don't get involved in any of the questions of issues or what should the concepts be. That's left entirely to the citizen jurors. And what was so surprising out of all of this is that the first concept that they came up with is this participatory governance. And what I was so not just pleasantly surprised, I was just so encouraged by that, because that is exactly what we think is needed to transform ourselves and our cities. So here are they presented each of these slides, and I'm not going to go through all of them because my particular shtick, as you can see, is participatory governance. I'm just going to stick with the first one, and you can read there why they thought that this was necessary. This is these citizens understood, and this is the frustration that many citizens have, is that they don't feel their voice is heard. Yes, it might be done as a token exercise in a focus group or a town hall meeting, but it doesn't really get to the heart of what people want. If you give people the real opportunity and the authority, because this process starts with the council saying they need to respond in writing to the recommendations that these jurors come up with. So they can't just fob it off. And mind you, after having spent 3 months, as I say, quite a dedicated amount of time to study what is necessary for the city, they're not easily fobbed off. So in conclusions, I want to just talk about where these mini publics have occurred. I mentioned that the OECD have done this report. It just came out at the beginning of this month. You can see that we in Australia are actually leading the world in terms of how many of these mini publics have been done over the last 20 or 30 years. We're really proud of that. We have now, in our own right, actually helped seed an international network of deliberative Democrats. And We are meeting regularly every year for the last 3 years now. There is a whole deliberative wave that is happening internationally now, where people are so frustrated with the way we do politics, where the way the politicians, and it's not their fault, they're well-meaning, but they get stuck in a system that requires them to basically continue to operate in spin mode and position themselves distinctively from the others, and it's so counterproductive. This process seems to be a better way of doing public policy. And I wanted to say that it's now being institutionalized in a number of countries. So this is a little town in Belgium called Eupen. Eupen actually has a German-speaking community, which I was not aware of, but I visited there. I was part of the group that advised this parliament here. They have their own autonomous regional parliament, and they had such a good experience with a citizen jury on childcare that they thought that they should introduce that practice as a permanent feature to their parliament. So they introduced a citizens' council as the sitting alongside their existing parliament as an advisory group that would determine in its own right whether they thought, the council thought that the parliament had overlooked or not attended to a particular matter appropriately. They would then, the council, determine to establish a separate citizens jury to investigate that question. So that's one example of how it can be institutionalized. Here's another example in Toronto. So Toronto now for the last 5 years have had a permanent citizens panel advising their urban planning department. So once again, a bit like Eupen, they look to this citizens planning panel, look to advise the existing bureaucrats, public servants, as to what they, as a citizen group, deem is important for urban planning. These citizens are rotated regularly as they are in Eupen. They rotate out every 2 years, and so there's a refreshment there of them. There's no entrenched incumbency, which often happens in political life. So I wanted to finish just with this last slide, which I think is just a sort of a theoretical slide, talking about what is the best way to go about addressing public policy matters. We've just heard from Tim this morning, what a great presentation from the CSIRO, and on how best to aggregate knowledge in a sphere, in any particular, on any particular subject. What I say that when there are subjects that are socio-political, what you need to have in that yellow circle there are a representative group of the people, the community at large. The way we've constituted that yellow circle, that golden circle, to date has been with this electioneering model. That electioneering model, in my view, is reaching its use-by date. It will not, it doesn't, you can see what's happening around the world, and we don't have to point to our founding fathers in the US to see how bitter and divisive that electioneering model has created, you know, in its effect. So, if you have a collaborative group of people, which are the reflective of the community at large, and they're also, mind you, mostly populated by people, of course, who don't have a great deal of wealth. So they actually, you are including in that group everyone. So everyone feels like they have a say in the determinations of whatever it may be. And we find that it is a most exemplary way for others, the broader community, to see that this is a better way to do public policy development. And in the process, of course, we then talk about taking action. So, you know, there needs to be an executive class to take action. I'm not saying necessarily that this golden circle here, the legislature, should necessarily take action. I know that in our Westminster system, we have this mix up of executive and legislature, and that's you know, that's the way we've grown up with it here in Australia and the UK and New Zealand for that matter. But there are other ways to envisage how we might do the executive. And, you know, there is a very competent public service class who can go forward as exists already now at local government, state government, federal government level. Clearly, the legislature needs to have the capacity to hire and fire. You know, so what I'm suggesting, I think we are on a journey here to understand how we might do democracy better. As I say, I think the way we're currently doing it today is really suboptimal, and I encourage you to look at alternatives. Thank you.